He didn't have to raise his voice to ruin a holiday. He only had to show up. The first time Olivia learned that truth, the Christmas lights were still blinking in the window behind her, and her ex-husband was already wearing that familiar expression of polished concern, the one that looked compassionate from a distance and cruel up close. The dining room smelled like cinnamon, roasted turkey, and the faint metallic chill of winter air each time the door opened. Her family's laughter had just begun to soften around the table when Ethan set his napkin down with deliberate calm, as if he had been waiting for the room to settle so he could take it over. Olivia stayed seated, one hand wrapped around her tea mug, her shoulders straight, her face unreadable. She had once mistaken his precision for strength, his control for stability, his silence for depth. Back when they were married, she had learned to measure the weather in his moods. A missed text could become a lecture. A different opinion could become a week of cold distance. A holiday, especially, became his stage. He always wanted his disappointment to arrive dressed as reason. "You really did all this by yourself?" he asked, glancing over the table as if he were inspecting a project rather than a home filled with people who loved her. His smile was thin. "I suppose some women get used to doing things the hard way." The relatives nearby went quiet. A fork paused midair. Someone at the far end of the table pretended to study their plate. Olivia felt the familiar pressure rise behind her ribs, that old instinct to explain herself, to soften the moment, to rescue everyone from his discomfort. But this time she only looked at him. Not wide-eyed, not wounded, just still. The kind of stillness that does not invite argument because it has already outgrown it. Ethan shifted first, as if her silence had failed to give him the reaction he expected. That was the first crack in his performance. He had built himself on the belief that she would always bend, always hurry to make peace, always hand him the final word so the evening could continue without embarrassment. But the woman sitting at that table was no longer trying to survive his moods. She had learned, slowly and painfully, that peace was not something he could give or take away. Peace was something she could protect. A child's laughter drifted from the living room. The candles on the mantel trembled in the draft and threw soft gold across Olivia's face. She did not reach for the old apology. She did not lower her eyes. She simply set her mug down, folded her hands, and waited. Ethan's smile faltered, just slightly, then steadied again, but the room had already changed. The air was different now, colder for him, clearer for her, and for the first time in years, Olivia understood that the most powerful thing she could do was not fight for her voice. It was keep it. By the next morning, the house felt different in the quiet way a room changes after a storm has passed. The ornaments were still in their boxes by the hallway bench, the garlands still looped over the mantel, but Olivia moved through the kitchen as if she were reclaiming something sacred. She opened the curtains and let pale winter light spill across the counters. Outside, the bare branches of the maple trees stood against a gray sky, delicate and stubborn, like they had survived worse seasons than this. She wrapped both hands around a warm mug of coffee and stood there for a long moment, simply breathing. No one asked her to smile. No one asked her to explain herself. That, more than anything, felt like freedom. She spent the rest of the morning making a list on the back of an old grocery receipt. Not resolutions. Boundaries. There were only a few, written in careful black ink. She would not answer his calls after dark. She would not apologize for saying no. She would not let anyone turn a holiday into a courtroom for her feelings. The words looked small on paper, but they steadied her. At noon, she drove to a neighborhood market with a red scarf wrapped around her coat and bought cinnamon sticks, oranges, a bundle of white lilies, and a set of linen napkins she did not need but loved. The cashier complimented her basket, and Olivia smiled in a way that reached her eyes, surprised by how natural it felt. Back home, she set the lilies in a glass vase on the counter and trimmed their stems with slow, deliberate care. She turned on the radio low enough to hear the static between songs, and the apartment filled with a soft, lived-in warmth. There was no grand transformation in that moment, no dramatic music, no witness to applaud her courage. Just small choices made with intention. A candle lit before dusk, a blanket folded at the foot of the sofa, a bowl of oranges on the table, bright as little suns. When her phone buzzed that evening, she glanced at the screen and saw Ethan's name. For 1 second, the old reflex stirred, the old urge to smooth things over, to keep the peace by surrendering a piece of herself. But then she looked at the list on the counter, at the lilies opening slowly in the winter light, and she let the phone ring out. The sound faded into the room, thin and useless. Olivia set the phone face down and poured herself more coffee, unhurried and calm. She was learning that silence did not mean surrender. Sometimes silence was structure. Sometimes it was a door locked from the inside. And as the light slipped lower across the floorboards, she understood something she had never been allowed to believe before. Peace was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of self-respect. By the third morning after the holiday, Olivia no longer moved through the apartment like someone waiting for weather to change. She moved like someone who had decided the weather belonged to her now. The kettle whispered on the stove. Soft winter light touched the rim of her coffee mug. On the windowsill, a small vase of white lilies opened a little more each hour, patient and unbothered, as if they knew what she was learning to remember. Ethan had sent 2 messages overnight, both polished and ordinary, the kind of texts that pretended nothing had happened. She did not answer either one. Instead, she set her phone beside the fruit bowl, unlocked her laptop, and opened a folder she had been avoiding for months. Not his emails, not the old photos, her own notes, her own plans. The file was simple, almost embarrassingly small, a budget, a list of holiday expenses, and a page she had titled, quietly and almost as a joke, Silent Power. She stared at the words for a long moment, then underlined them once with a blue pen. Step 1 was clarity. She wrote down every pattern she had been swallowing in silence, every interruption, every forced apology, every holiday ruined by his need to dominate the room and then call it concern. The page filled slowly, line by line, until the truth looked less like a wound and more like a map. Step 2 was distance. She made boundaries the way other people made reservations, firmly, in advance, without guilt. No surprise visits. No last-minute changes. No answering calls that arrived only to drag her back into confusion. When her sister called around noon, Olivia answered on the first ring. She listened. She laughed once, softly, at something small and familiar. And when the conversation ended, she did not feel empty the way she used to after speaking her mind. She felt steady. By afternoon, she had changed the sheets, swept the kitchen floor, and placed a candle near the sink. The flame was small, but it gave the room a clean, amber glow. Step 3 was presence. Not performance. Not proving anything. Just showing up fully for her own life. Even in ordinary moments that no one would ever applaud. She cooked soup with carrots and thyme, set the table for one, and sat down without turning on the television to fill the silence. Outside, the maple trees stood bare against the bright gray sky, their branches thin but unbroken. Her phone lit up again. Ethan. Then again. She watched the screen pulse in her hand like a borrowed heartbeat. Then she silenced it and placed it face down. No trembling. No explanation. No performance. The room remained calm, and for the first time, that calm felt earned. When evening settled over the apartment, Olivia opened the curtains wider and let the last of the winter light move across the floorboards. She looked at the lilies, at the candle, at the notebook open beside her plate, and she understood something that had taken years to arrive. Peace was not something he could grant or take away. Peace was what remained when she stopped asking permission to protect herself. By the time the 4th morning came, Olivia no longer woke with that old, startled feeling that used to grip her before the sun even touched the curtains. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt chosen, not forced. Morning light moved across the pale kitchen tiles, and the little vase of white lilies on the counter had opened a little more overnight, their petals soft against the glass. She stood at the stove in a sweater sleeves pushed to her wrists, waiting for the water to heat, while the city outside slowly found its voice. No one was shouting. No one was demanding. No one was walking through her peace as if it belonged to him. That alone felt almost unreal. She poured the coffee into her favorite mug, the one with the chipped gold line near the handle, and carried it to the window. Beyond the glass, the winter trees stood bare and elegant, their branches traced in gray light. Ethan's messages still lit up her phone from time to time, but they did not pull her attention the way they once would have. She glanced at the screen, saw the name, and let it go dark again. There was no fear in that motion, only quiet. Later, She opened the small box of holiday decorations she had bought for herself the day after Christmas, not because anyone was coming over, but because she had decided her own life deserved warmth. A simple candle, a cream-colored throw, a few clear ornaments she hung by the window where they caught the light and turned it soft. It was nothing extravagant, nothing anyone would post about, but every small choice felt like a hand returning to her own shoulder. In the afternoon, she bundled up and walked to the neighborhood market on her own, the cold air crisp against her cheeks, her boots steady on the sidewalk. She bought fresh bread, apples, and a bundle of evergreen clippings from the florist near the corner. The woman behind the counter smiled at her and said, "You seem like you know what you are doing." Olivia had almost laughed at that. For so long, she had only known how to survive someone else's moods. Now she was learning how to build something quieter and stronger. When she came back, she set the groceries on the counter, filled a small bowl with apples, and arranged the evergreen beside the candle as if she were creating a still life for no one but herself. Then she stood back and looked at it. The room did not need to be grand to feel sacred. It only needed to be hers. That evening, as the sky deepened into blue and the windows reflected the soft glow from her lamp, Ethan called again. This time, she did not even reach for the phone. She let it ring until it stopped, then folded a blanket around her shoulders and sat down with a book she had not opened in years. The first page felt strange. The second felt familiar. By the third, her breathing had slowed. Somewhere in the apartment, a radiator clicked softly. Outside, a car passed through the wet street with its headlights low and blurred. Inside, Olivia turned another page and realized something she had spent too many years forgetting. Peace was not something he could interrupt whenever he pleased. Peace was the life she kept choosing, one calm decision at a time. By the fifth morning, Olivia had started to trust the quiet again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. The apartment had settled into a rhythm so gentle it almost felt like a kind hand over a skittish heart. Steam rose from her mug beside the window. A wool blanket lay folded on the arm of the sofa. The white lilies on the counter had opened wider, their petals catching the pale winter light like small, patient promises. She moved through the kitchen in soft socks, hair loosely tied back, and for the first time in years, she did not feel the need to brace herself for a voice that might cut through the morning. Her phone sat face down near the fruit bowl, untouched for hours. Ethan had called twice before noon, and both times she had watched the screen glow and fade without moving. Not in anger, not in fear, simply because she no longer belonged to his schedule of apologies, demands, and sudden intrusions. A peace she had once mistaken for loneliness now felt like space opening inside her chest, clean and measurable, like a room that could finally be aired out after years of closed windows. In the afternoon, she walked to the neighborhood market with a canvas tote over her shoulder, choosing oranges one by one, letting the cold brush her cheeks awake. The cashier asked if she wanted her receipt, and Olivia smiled when she said yes, as if that small choice mattered. It did. Everything did now. On the way home, she passed a row of townhouses dressed in wreaths and muted ribbon, each front stoop lit by a warm lamp against the gray day. Families moved behind windows. Bells chimed from a storefront door. Somewhere, a child laughed too loudly and then ran out of frame. Olivia paused at the crosswalk and watched the traffic slide by, headlights reflecting off wet pavement. No one was asking her to explain herself. No one was measuring her worth by how quickly she could smooth over discomfort for someone else. When she got back inside, she set the oranges in a bowl, changed into a soft cardigan, and opened the small notebook she had started keeping on the kitchen table. It was not a journal in any dramatic sense. No grand confession, just lists, groceries, bills, places she wanted to visit, books she wanted to finish, a new recipe for soup, a reminder to buy more lilies before the week ended. Yet even those plain words felt like proof of life, evidence that her days no longer revolved around surviving someone else's mood. Then, just as evening began to settle and the apartment turned golden at the edges, there was a knock at the door. Olivia looked up slowly, not startled, not frozen, just aware. She set her pen down, crossed the room, and opened the door to find a long, narrow box on the doormat, wrapped in cream paper and tied with a simple dark ribbon. No name on the label, no return address, only her first name, written in careful black ink. For a moment, she stood still, the winter air curling in around her ankles, the hallway quiet behind the package. Then she bent and lifted it with both hands. It was lighter than she expected, almost fragile. And yet, when she brought it inside and placed it on the table, something in the room seemed to hold its breath with her. The box sat on Olivia's table like a quiet question. She had left the cream ribbon untouched for several minutes, letting the apartment settle around it, listening to the soft tick of the kitchen clock and the low winter hush beyond the windows. Outside, the bare branches of the maple trees moved in the wind with a dry, whispering patience. Inside, the room held the warm smell of chamomile tea, beeswax, and the lilies she had placed by the sink 2 days earlier. Olivia stood there in her sweater sleeves, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, looking at the package as if it might explain itself if she waited long enough. It did not. So she sat down, drew in one slow breath, and untied the ribbon. The lid lifted with a soft sigh. Inside was a silk scarf, folded with almost ceremonial care, ivory with a deep emerald border so rich it seemed to gather the winter light instead of reflecting it. Beneath it lay a card. Not from Daniel. Not from anyone who knew how to wound her in familiar ways. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and unfamiliar. She opened the card and read only a few lines, then read them again. You do not need to arrive loudly. You only need to arrive as yourself. The words did not flatter her. They did not promise ease. They simply landed, steady and exact, like a hand placed gently over a racing pulse. Olivia stared at the note until the edges blurred a little, then set it beside her plate without folding it away. Something in her chest loosened, not all at once, but enough to be felt. She touched the scarf, letting the silk slip across her fingertips. It was softer than she expected, cool at first, then warming against her skin. For a moment, she could almost see herself wearing it, standing beneath brighter light, no longer trying to disappear into the background of someone else's anger. The phone on the counter remained dark. No holiday message from Daniel. No sharp text pretending to be polite. No late apology dressed as concern. Just silence, and for once, that silence did not feel empty. It felt clean. She folded the scarf back into the box with care and looked around the apartment. The lamp in the corner cast a soft amber glow across the books stacked by the sofa. A half-finished knitting project rested in a basket near the chair. Her notebook lay open on the table beside a list she had started that morning. By pairs, call Lauren, replace the cracked mug with the blue rim, finish the last chapter before Friday. Ordinary things. Small things. But they belonged to her now, and that made them feel dignified in a way she had never understood when life was built around surviving another person's moods. A knock sounded again, quieter this time, as if whoever stood outside already understood that this was not a house that welcomed chaos. Olivia rose, crossed the room, and checked the peephole. No one was there. Only a thin envelope resting against the doorframe, cream-colored and sealed with a dark wax stamp. She opened the door, looked into the empty hallway, then picked up the envelope and returned inside. Her name was written on the front in the same careful hand. Inside was an invitation to a holiday charity dinner 2 evenings away, the kind of event Daniel used to mock as pointless theater. The venue was a restored hotel downtown, all polished stone, glass ornaments, and old-world elegance. At the bottom of the page was one more line. A seat has been reserved in your name. Olivia held the card for a long moment, then set it flat on the table and stood very still. There was no tremor in her hands, no rush of panic, only that quiet, familiar pulse of recognition, the sense that the world had just shifted 1 inch in her favor. She looked again at the scarf, at the invitation, at the note that had asked nothing of her except presence, and she understood that this was no accident. Someone had seen her, not as a shadow of her former life, but as a woman who had already begun to rebuild. And somewhere in the city, under golden lights and polished ceilings, the next part of her life was already waiting. By the time the charity dinner began, Olivia had already learned the difference between being invited and being expected. The hotel downtown glowed under winter lights, its restored marble lobby polished to a soft shine, chandeliers spilling gold across the walls, and the air filled with the quiet murmur of donors, glasses, and polite laughter that never quite reached anyone's eyes. She stood for a moment beneath the entry arch, her coat still closed, the the cream invitation folded neatly inside her clutch. Around her, women in tailored velvet and men in dark wool moved with the easy confidence of people who had long ago decided they belonged in rooms like this. Olivia breathed in slowly, feeling the familiar pulse of old nerves, but this time they did not own her. She had worn a simple dress in a deep winter blue, elegant without trying to prove anything, and the scarf from the package rested lightly around her shoulders like a private promise. Then she saw him. Daniel. He was across the ballroom near the bar, already performing for the room in the way he always had, laughing too loudly, one hand in his pocket, the other resting with practiced ease near the woman at his side, as though their presence together were a trophy he had brought to display. He had not seen Olivia yet, and for one brief second she watched him from the edge of the light, studying the version of himself he offered strangers. The polished smile, the expensive watch, the slight tilt of his chin that suggested the world still owed him attention. Beside him, his new wife stood in a pale shimmer of sequins, glancing around with the restless satisfaction of someone waiting to be admired. Olivia did not flinch. She only noticed how small his laughter sounded against the room, how hard he worked to look untouchable. Then the first reaction came from the side of the ballroom, a subtle turn of heads, a pause in conversation, the kind that traveled quickly in elegant places. Olivia turned with it, and that was when she saw the man walking in beside the event host. He was tall, composed, and unmistakably at ease in the center of the room, carrying no need to announce himself because the room seemed to make space for him on instinct. His suit was dark, precise, and understated, but everything about him suggested quiet authority rather than performance. He said almost nothing as he moved, yet every person he passed seemed to straighten as if they had just remembered manners. Olivia had met him only once before, briefly, after the invitation had arrived, and even then he had spoken to her with the steady courtesy of someone who listened more than he explained. Tonight, as he scanned the room, his gaze found hers immediately, not the way men looked at women when they wanted something. Not with curiosity, not with calculation, with recognition. Daniel had still not noticed, but the host had. And now the man at Olivia's side had. The shift was small enough to miss if one blinked, but in the stillness of the room it felt enormous. Daniel finally turned, following the change in attention, and his smile faltered as if it had struck an unseen wall. His eyes moved once, then again, landing on Olivia as though his mind refused to accept what his face already knew. She was not alone. She was not waiting. She was not where he had last left her, folded into silence and inconvenience. She stood with her shoulders relaxed, her hands steady, and the scarf he had never seen around her neck catching the warm light like something newly earned. The man beside her stepped closer, and his presence changed the air around her in a way no one could ignore. There was no need for a grand declaration yet. The room was already beginning to understand that Olivia had not arrived to be measured. She had arrived with a future beside her, and Daniel, for all his polished certainty, was not prepared for the sight of a woman he had underestimated walking calmly into a life he could no longer reach. The room had gone quiet in that particular way expensive rooms did, where even silence seemed dressed for the occasion. Olivia stood near the edge of the ballroom with Daniel beside her, and she could feel the shift before she even saw it in his face. He had been smiling at the other guests a moment ago, that polished, effortless smile he wore whenever he wanted the room to believe he was in control. But now his gaze had locked onto the man at her side, and something inside that smile began to crack. The man beside Olivia did not announce himself. He did not need to. He simply adjusted the cuff of his dark coat, calm and unhurried, as if the attention of an entire ballroom were a small thing he had long ago learned to carry without effort. Olivia felt the warmth of his hand at the small of her back, steady and respectful, and for one brief second she let herself breathe into it. Not because she needed rescuing, because she was no longer standing alone. Daniel's eyes moved between them, searching for a mistake, some explanation that would restore the shape of the world he thought he understood. Olivia saw the moment his certainty began to fail him. It was there in the stiffness of his jaw, in the way his shoulders held too tightly beneath his expensive jacket, in the almost imperceptible pause before he spoke. "Olivia," he said, as though her name itself were a question he had not prepared to ask. His voice carried across the table nearest them, and several nearby conversations thinned into silence. She met his gaze without flinching. No apology lived in her expression. No bitterness either. Only the same quiet composure she had been building, one decision at a time, morning after morning, long after he had mistaken her silence for weakness. "You came," he added, and there it was, the old entitlement, dressed up as surprise. As if her presence was still something he had the right to approve or dismiss. The man beside her gave the smallest nod, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that made the room seem smaller around him. Olivia felt Daniel's eyes catch on the detail he could not yet place. The watch, the tailored coat, the unhurried certainty. People at the nearest tables began glancing over. A woman lifted her glass and forgot to drink. Someone quietly set down a fork. The air changed in layers, first curiosity, then recognition, then the kind of tension that comes when a person realizes too late that they may have judged the wrong room. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked as though he wanted to ask the man's name, but pride kept the question lodged in his throat. Olivia could almost hear him measuring possibilities, each one less comfortable than the last. Had she found someone new? Was this a friend, a client, a mistake he could still minimize? None of those answers gave him back the ground beneath his feet. The man beside her finally extended his hand, not to Daniel, but to the host of the evening approaching from the side, a man who stopped so abruptly his smile nearly vanished. "It is good to see everything running smoothly," he said, his tone even, his authority subtle but unmistakable. The host straightened at once, visibly surprised, and Olivia watched the realization begin to travel through the room in small, electric waves. Her companion was not simply a guest. He was someone the staff recognized, someone the hotel moved around before he even asked, someone whose presence changed the temperature of the entire evening. Daniel noticed it too. The color drained from his face in a careful, almost elegant way, as if humiliation itself had learned to dress in restraint. Olivia did not look away. She did not rush to explain. She simply held her place beside the man who had come with her hands calm at her sides, her back straight, her face composed. For so long, Daniel had relied on her silence to make himself feel larger. Tonight, that silence belonged to her, and it was no longer empty. It was full of distance, of dignity, of a life he had already lost access to. He had expected to see the version of her he could once interrupt, redirect, or diminish. Instead, he was staring at a woman who had made herself unrecognizable to his control. And as the first crack of understanding passed through the room, Olivia understood something with absolute clarity. The most powerful moment was not the one where he would finally be told the truth. It was this one, where he had to stand inside it before he was ready. The announcement had already been made, but for Olivia, the room's silence lingered long after the words faded. She stood very still beneath the soft gold of the chandeliers, her fingers resting lightly at her side, her expression composed in the way that only came after someone had survived being underestimated for too long. Around her, guests shifted, cleared their throats, and exchanged those quick, startled glances that said everything without a single sentence. Daniel was no longer the center of the room. He was no longer the man setting the temperature, deciding who mattered, deciding who was small enough to ignore. That power had slipped from him quietly, almost imperceptibly, and now he stood in it, trapped inside a moment he had not prepared for. Olivia felt no rush to fill the silence. That was the difference now. Once, she would have tried to smooth things over, to protect his pride, to speak softly enough to keep the peace he demanded. Tonight, her peace was not fragile. It was structured. It had edges. It had weight. Beside her, the man who had arrived with her remained calm, one hand tucked in his pocket, the other resting loosely at his side, as if he had all the time in the world. He did not need to announce himself. He did not need to compete for attention. There was something about him that made attention gather naturally, like light finding glass. When one of the board members stepped forward and greeted him with unmistakable respect, Olivia noticed Daniel's jaw tighten. Not enough for anyone else to call it out. Enough for her to see. Just enough. That was the beauty of it. The room did not need a loud explosion to change forever. It only needed the truth to stand there, patient and visible. Olivia looked across the ballroom and saw it happen in small pieces. The hostess lowering her champagne flute, a longtime donor staring too long, a colleague of Daniel's suddenly finding the tablecloth fascinating. Recognition traveled faster than rumor ever could. He was not simply a guest. He was the man who had signed the agreements, approved the expansion, and quietly held the future Daniel had bragged about for years without ever understanding. And Olivia, standing at his side, was no longer the woman Daniel had tried to diminish with private criticism and public charm. She was the woman who had built herself into someone steady enough to be chosen, and calm enough not to need applause for it. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was careful, almost polite, as if manners could shield him from what he was feeling. Olivia heard the strain underneath it. She answered with the same quiet courtesy she had learned to use as armor, a small nod, a measured smile, nothing more. That was all it took to leave him with the emptiest thing of all, the knowledge that she no longer needed his acknowledgement to exist fully in a room. She had not returned to win him back. She had returned as proof that his ending had not been hers. And as the evening moved on around them, with crystal glasses glowing in the light and soft music lifting through the air, Olivia felt the final lock inside her loosen. The holidays, the memories, the old ache of being made small by someone who mistook silence for surrender, all of it had once felt endless. But now, in this room full of witnesses, she could see the shape of her life clearly. It belonged to her. It had become larger than his opinion, warmer than his approval, and stronger than every attempt to keep her in the past.